that we were going to be speaking with you. And I told him that you're going to share a little bit about yourself and your ties to Cass City and your experiences as an astronaut and working for NASA. And then we'd have some questions for you at the end.
Okay, that sounds fine. It would be really good if this were a conversation and not a lecture. So I grew up in Cass City. Actually, I grew up on this farm, which is, can you see that?
Yes.
And that's 6 miles out of town. And many of the kids in my class at Cass City High School were farm kids, both boys and girls alike. And if you have experience with farms around the area, you know that growing up on a farm is a very good way to grow up, I think. You learn how to work hard. You learn how to have responsibility and take care of things like animals. And so you are preparing yourself for life. Now, when our class got out of high school in 1963, we all went our separate ways. A lot of people kind of knew what they wanted to do, and there were jobs plentiful in the automobile factories at that time. So a lot of people went to work in the car factories. Many of us went to college. Some of us knew why we were going to college. In other words, we knew what we wanted to get an education to help us do for a career. Others of us, myself included, didn't have a clue yet, but knew enough that a college education was going to open a lot of doors, and so it was a good thing to do. In 1963, I think there were 2,000 or so residents of Cass City. I believe that is still the case, but we had 3 grocery stores, IGA, Erla's, and Freiberger's, and I understand that you have 0. That's a shame. But we still have 1 stoplight back in 63 and now. So Saturday, the 20th, is a big milestone in the career field that I chose to be in, human spaceflight. It's the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing on the moon. And I'm betting those of you who were alive then remember where you were and what you were doing when Neil Armstrong first stepped onto the moon. I know that I do for sure. Does anybody remember?
Yes.
Give me an example. Don't be shy.
Where were you?
I was in my living room watching TV.
Watching it on television.
That's a fair answer. Yeah. So was I with my wife, Kathy, who in fact, let's see, this was in July, so we had just been married 2 months when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon. So it was a good summer all around. So in May 1963, when we left high school, 10 human beings had orbited the Earth, starting with Yuri Gagarin, the Russian. But between Russians and Americans, 10 people had orbited the Earth at that time. Now, in 2019, July, I think the nearest count I can get is 533 human beings have orbited our planet. 533. 355 of those did so on the space shuttle. That's one of the reasons I love the space shuttle so much, is because it flew over half of the human beings to orbit that have made it. But considering that there's, 7.7 billion people in the world, 533 is a pretty small number, very, very small. And we've only been doing this for 60 years, roughly, flying humans in space. So it's slow going, and it's going to take a long time before we get a reasonable percentage of humans with that kind of experience. But I wish you all could have that kind of experience, because it's a wonderful gift to be able to observe our planet from orbit and do the things that we've been able to do, not only in exploring the moon, but in all of the things that the space shuttle did for us as a nation and as a species on Earth. So I know that none of you have a very good appreciation for what weightlessness is like. And that's one of the two things that being in orbit around the Earth offers us that are unique to that environment. Weightlessness for the people inside the spacecraft, and vacuum outside the spacecraft. So scientists use both of those things, weightlessness and vacuum, to do in scientific investigations so we can learn more about our life on Earth and the life in the universe around us. So let me just try to explain, or describe rather, what weightlessness is like in a way that maybe you could have a feel for. Imagine you're in your bathtub and it's got quite a bit of water in it, so you're floating in it, and it's a big bathtub, so you're not touching the sides or the foot or the head. You're just floating there, and the temperature of the water is about body temperature. So you really, it's almost like you can't feel the water. You're just kind of floating there in your bathtub. And it's very relaxing. It's very comfortable. And then imagine that without anything else happening, nothing else changing, the water just goes away. But you don't. You're still there, and you're still floating like that. And the temperature is perfect for you. It's comfortable, and you're just floating there. And if you want to move, you reach over and you push a little bit on one side of the tub or the other, and you go in the opposite direction. That's what weightlessness feels like. It's a lot of fun. It's a wonderful feeling. It's a great way to sleep at night, whenever your night is on orbit. But scientists use that, the condition of weightlessness, to do all kinds of experiments that we can't do on Earth because we have to deal with gravity on Earth. And of course, everybody knows what vacuum is. It just means there aren't enough molecules of air or other gases there to be measurable. And so everything is exposed directly to the radiation that's coming from the sun and other sources in the galaxies. And so again, it offers a unique environment in which scientists can do experiments, scientific investigations that help us learn more about how we got here and what's going to happen to our planet in the future. So that's kind of an introduction, I guess, of where I came from and what I like about spaceflight. So let's have some dialogue now. That means questions and answers both ways.
Okay. So I have a whole list of questions here, and I tried to put them somewhat relating to one another. So the first one I have is from Jessica, age 10, and she wants to know, how old is your rocket ship?
Okay, my rocket ship. Wow, I wish I had one. But Jessica, age 10, is the same age as one of my 3 granddaughters. And so I get questions like that. Let's see, the space shuttles, which is the rocket that I flew on, and I flew in the 1980s. The first flight of the space shuttle into orbit was in 1981. It flew in the atmosphere before that, doing landing tests off the back of a 747 aircraft. But it was built and designed throughout the late 60s and the 70s. And then we flew from 1981 to 2011. 135 flights were launched of the space shuttle during those 30 years. And all but 2 of them were successful missions, and we recovered the vehicles back and recovered the crew. Unfortunately, 1 was lost during ascent, and another one was lost during entry due to problems with the hardware, the vehicles themselves. But that's kind of how old the rocket that I know about is.
Okay. So the next one I have is from Eli, age 5, and he says, what is it like to fly? What does it feel like to fly in a spaceship?
Okay. Once you're on orbit, it feels like I just described, because you're weightless inside your spacecraft. And so you float around inside. If you want to stay in one position, you have to fasten yourself somehow by using little bungees on the floor to stick your toes under, or use a strap or something like that. But it feels just like weightlessness, because it is. Getting there and getting back, however, is a different thing. In the space shuttle system, and again, that's the only system that I have personal experience with, the only one that I got to fly. It has liquid engines on the shuttle that burn oxygen and hydrogen, liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. And then it has on the sides of the big tank solid rocket motors that burn a solid chemical, kind of like a rubbery chemical that is loaded inside the cases of the solid rocket motors. So when you launch, at 6 seconds before liftoff, the liquid engines in the back end of the space shuttle light, and they start to produce thrust. And the thrust is not enough to lift the stack off the pad, but it's enough to make it bend a little bit, because the engines kind of don't point straight down, they point upwards a little bit relative to the space shuttle. So it makes the whole stack bend a little bit, and then it's kind of springs back, and it's timed so that when it gets back almost straight up, that's when the solid rocket motors are ignited. And when that happens, it feels like somebody hit the back of your chair with a sledgehammer. It is very sharp. It just seats your back into the seat very strongly, and the whole thing starts shaking. It just shakes and shakes and shakes from those solid rocket motors. In fact, it shakes so much that the cathode ray tube screens, or the computer screens that we had on board, are a little bit blurry, and you're pushed back in your seat so much that if you want to reach a switch or something, you want to do something with your hand, you have to allow for the fact that your hand is being pushed back because of the force of the acceleration as you go. And so the first 2 minutes are like that. You're just shaking like crazy, and you're stuck back in your seat really hard, and you're just hoping the pointy end stays forward, if you know what I mean. Then after 2 minutes, all of the propellant in these big solid motors is expended. And so they are released from the sides of the tank and pushed away, and the space shuttle and the tank that's holding the liquid oxygen and the liquid hydrogen continues to go. But now with much smaller push, because those big solids, they put out over 3 million pounds of thrust each. And there's three engines on the shuttle, the liquid engines, only put out about 1.2 or 1.3 million pounds altogether. So it's a big decrease in thrust. So now you feel pretty comfortable. You're still laying on your back because your nose is pointed up and you're accelerating, but you can move much more easily. The shaking is all gone. It's just this nice, smooth push. And those of you that know F equals ma, that equation, if force is constant and mass is going down, that means the rate of acceleration is going up. And so the rate of acceleration then increases slowly as you burn out the liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen fuels. And when it gets up to 3 Gs of acceleration, which makes you feel like, you weigh 3 times as much as you do, but you're also gaining almost 100 feet per second every second. When it gets there, then the engines are throttled down by the computers. to maintain 3Gs until the vehicle hits a velocity or a speed target that will enable it to make it into orbit. And then the engines are shut off, and all of a sudden, everything's floating because you are in your spacecraft and you're just kind of like, in orbit. So that's what the ride uphill is like. It is a thrilling, exhilarating experience. If you went to the county fair and got on your favorite ride and stayed there for a long time, that's sort of what it feels like, that exhilaration of the launch experience. Then coming home is much more gentle. All you have to do to come home is slow down a little bit. When the space shuttle or any spacecraft is in low Earth orbit, it's going about 17,500 miles an hour. And if you convert that to feet per second, it's about 25,800 feet per second. And all you have to do is slow down 200 to 300 feet per second, and it will change your orbit so much that on the side of the Earth opposite where you do this slow down burn, you will start to intersect the top of the atmosphere. And once you start coming down into the atmosphere, then drag takes over and it slows the vehicle continually until it gets down and plops on the Earth. But in the space shuttle, of course, since it had wings on it, we can actually fly it down in a controlled manner and land it on a runway. But the ride downhill, although it's spectacular from a lighting standpoint, because when you first start to re-enter the atmosphere, you're creating a plasma because you're going so fast, you're knocking electrons off the molecules and creating ions, which make a very, very hot gas. So it's all fire and flame and flashing outside and very, very hot. But that eventually goes away. And then it's just this pretty smooth ride down until you land on the runway. So on orbit, in ascent, and in entry, that's what it's like.
Okay, so our next question is, are spacesuits uncomfortable?
Well, yes. The answer is yes. The first time I flew in the space shuttle, we just wore like cotton flight suits. And then we had the Challenger accident. And then we wore partial pressure suits for ascent and entry. And partial pressure suits were designed that if the spacecraft had a leak and was losing pressure, your suit would pressurize and would keep you alive, would provide enough oxygen for you to survive for a long enough time to get back down on Earth. But what we learned when we lost the Columbia, which came apart during reentry, that those partial pressure suits won't protect you from the heat of reentry or the heat that's generated at very high speed if you get outside the vehicle. And when the vehicle broke up, Columbia broke up, the crew got outside the vehicle, and those suits didn't protect them. But we wore those after Challenger, and they were uncomfortable but tolerable. Needless to say, it's certainly worth the discomfort to go to orbit and have that experience and conduct your mission. Now, the EVA suits are another thing. Those are like being in a balloon, albeit at a fairly low pressure. But you know how a balloon gets stiff when you blow it up? Well, those EVA or extravehicular activity or spacewalk suits also get stiff. And so it takes a lot of effort to move around when you're in one of those suits. That's one of the reasons that we tried to limit the length of spacewalks to a reasonable number of hours so that people didn't get exhausted just functioning inside those suits. And sometimes they would have, if some part of your body rubbed against a joint of the suit or something like that, if they didn't fit real well, it would create hot spots on your body and be quite uncomfortable. So we tried to have suits that fit the people who are going to wear them very well. Next question.
Okay, next one is from Mia, age 15. Is it true that astronauts' backs stretch and get longer after a prolonged time in space? Is this myth or fact?
It's true because you take the load of gravity off your body, and so your body tends to relax. And in doing so, it gains a little bit of length, maybe an inch or two for an average size person who's flown in the space shuttle. But after you get back on Earth, gravity loads your skeletal structure again, and that lengthening disappears and goes away. Now, that lengthening in some people caused back pain while they were on orbit. Other people, like myself, I didn't have any back pain because of that factor. But yes, you do. Your skeleton does grow a little bit when there's no load squishing it like gravity.
Okay. So the next one says, what was the scariest, most nerve-wracking experience you had during your shuttle missions?
Well, it's complicated hardware and software. And although we are very diligent in designing these systems and we do a lot of testing of these systems, things can go wrong. And we had things go wrong throughout the space shuttle program. As I mentioned, we lost 2 orbiters, but the most wrong thing that ever happened to me was my first flight in 1983. We were getting ready to return to Earth after 10 days of being on orbit. And so we were changing the software load in the 5 main computers that the space shuttle has. And the 5 computers, you can assign different tasks to these computers. And 3 of these computers would put information on 3 different computer screens. And when the computer that is assigned to put information on a computer screen fails, the computer screen gets a big X, 2 lines in the form of an X, and it says on the words, it'll say poll fail. And that means that not only is the computer not talking to or commanding information to be displayed on the computer on the display screen, but it's not asking the display screen for any information to be sent back to it. In other words, the computer is non-functional. So as we were getting ready to deorbit on that mission, 2 of our computers did that to us. We had 2 computers that failed like that. And so in communication with the people in the mission control in Houston, we decided not to deorbit. We went around 6 more times, went around the Earth 6 more times. That took 9 hours while we worked on recovering or trying to recover these computers. We were able to recover one of them. The other one did not recover. The one that did recover, when we landed and the nose wheel hit the ground, it failed again. But it worked all the way down, and we assigned commands to some of the other computers so that if that one failed, it wouldn't be a big impact to us. We'd have redundancy. But it took us a while to figure out how to do all of that. And at the same time, we had a failure of one of 3 inertial measurement units, which are used for generating navigation and guidance information. And so we came down with 2 instead of 3. And then when we got on the ground, we found out that 2 of the 3 auxiliary power units, which are devices that have a catalyst bed that decomposes a liquid into a gas. It creates big pressure. You flow that pressure through a turbine. It turns a shaft. That shaft turns a hydraulic pump, and it creates hydraulic pressure to make the flight control surfaces move, just like on an airplane when the flight control surfaces move in response to the pilot's input. 2 of 3 of those APUs were on fire. We didn't know that until after we landed, so I'm glad of that. But those things were the most problematic things that I had to deal with in any of the 3 flights that I was privileged to participate in.
The next question is, why did you decide to become an astronaut?
That's a good question. I didn't do that until I had already graduated from college in engineering and I was getting a master's degree. And so that would have been in the fall of 1968 when I made this decision. And the decision was driven by basically 4 factors. Factor number 1, I had gotten a private pilot's license while going to college and I loved flying. Factor number 2, those guys up there who were flying Mercury, Gemini, and the early Apollo flights, getting ready to go to the moon, that looked terrifically interesting and terrifically exciting and terrifically much like something I thought I would like to do. Factor number 3 was, and you hear stories about these professors who have a impact on your life because they are such excellent teachers and such excellent human beings. They make you think about things that normal instruction doesn't. I mean, once in a lifetime, you have a professor or a teacher that impacts your life like that. And I had one. His name was Bud Schlack. He was a professor in engineering mechanics at the University of Wisconsin. And I took a celestial mechanics course from him. And that is the study of the laws of physics that control orbits and things like that. Why the moon goes around the earth the way it does, why the sun goes around, or why the earth goes around the sun the way it does, why a spacecraft will go around the earth the way it does. That's the study of that kind of stuff. And I loved that. The 4th thing was we were still in Vietnam and the draft board said, we're not going to defer you after you finish your master's degree. And so I was guaranteed, because I had a very low lottery number or draft number, they started having numbers then, and I had a very small number, so I would be sure to be drafted and go to Vietnam. And I decided I would rather go to Vietnam on a path that could get me to where those guys are up there, rather than carrying a rifle and a rice paddy. And all those guys at that time, when I made that decision, all of those guys were military test pilots. All the astronauts that NASA had hired then and that were involved in the early Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs were former military test pilots. So, here's a path. Fly, survive, get to go to test pilot school, survive, maybe then you can apply to work for NASA. That was the plan. And it took 9 years, but it worked out because I was hugely lucky. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay, so the next one is, how do you sleep in space?
Wonderfully. We have, on the space shuttle, we have like sleeping bags that you attach to the walls around. There's not a lot of space in the space shuttle, especially if you have 7 people on a crew, for example. And so you just fasten these things to the walls where you can, and then you kind of get in it like a hammock or like a sleeping bag, and it keeps you from floating around and bumping into switches, walls, other people. And so it keeps you in one spot. It's very comfortable, as I said, because you're not laying on your back, you're not laying on your stomach, you're not laying on your shoulder, you're just floating. And so it's very, very comfortable. I personally always slept on the flight deck. That's the upstairs part of the space shuttle capsule front end. And I would tie one end of this little hammock-like thing to the back of my chair and the other end to a switch guard on the back panel, and then it was like a hammock, and it just floated there. And if I got in it and zipped it up a little bit, it would keep me confined, and I wouldn't float around and bump things and wake myself or others up. And I always put on a Sony Walkman. Remember those little cassette? This is the 80s, remember? We had these little cassette players, Sony Walkman, and we had to record our own cassettes. NASA didn't do that for us. We had to do all that ourselves. But I would put in a cassette, and I'd put this headset on, and by the time it was done playing, I was asleep. And it was wonderful sleeping. And then the ground would call you from Houston when it was time to wake up. So you didn't have to worry about setting an alarm. So sleeping was fabulous. I really enjoyed it.
What's that? Oh, they want to know, what kind of music did you listen to in your Walkman?
Well, that's funny. I paid for the majority of my college education by playing rock and roll music in a band at college. And so I liked rock music, but rock music is not real conducive to sleeping. So I had a couple of tapes of people like Judy Collins, Joni Mitchell, Joan Baez, people with melodic, comforting voices that just made you kind of, the sound of their voices and the music just made me relax. And so that worked really well. And right now I'm in Telluride, Colorado. Kathy and I are here. And last year, actually 2 years ago, we went to see Judy Collins in the little Sheridan Opera House. She was putting on a concert. And in the worst way, I wanted to tell her that I had used her music to get to sleep in the space shuttle. I thought she'd get a kick out of that. But it's hard to talk to those people. As you can imagine, you don't get close to somebody like Judy Collins very easily. But that's what I used.
Okay, so the next question is, are there any experiments in zero gravity with flying birds or insects that you know about?
No, not loose. We have had insects, but they're contained. You don't want them getting loose, and certainly no birds that I'm aware of. The space shuttle or any space capsule is in an enclosed environment, and you're breathing it. And so things like crumbs from bread in a sandwich or something like that, if that gets loose and starts floating around, you're liable to breathe it, you're liable to get it in your eyes. It's just going to be a real irritant. And we do have filters and fans that move the air through these filters to capture that kind of stuff, but you really try to avoid having that sort of thing loose in your environment, in your air. And so having loose bugs of any kind would not be a good plan.
Okay, so the next one is, do you think the USA should go back to the moon, or should we go on to other planets?
Well, the only planet that makes sense for human beings at this point to try to get to is, of course, Mars, because it is the most hospitable planet that we could reach in a reasonable amount of time. If we go towards the sun, it's hot. The Venus and Mercury are very inhospitable. And if we go out away past Mars, it's really, really cold. And they are equally, the gas giants are equally unhospitable. So Mars is really, with the information that the human species has now, Mars is really the only place where we could consider reasonably trying to explore with human beings. but it's a hazardous trip. Just like it was hazardous when Borman and those guys were the first ones to go into orbit around the moon, and then when Neil and Buzz landed on the moon, going to Mars is going to be very, very hazardous because you're so far away. If things go wrong, help is a long way away. Communications take a long time. It's just a very long trip in a very unhospitable environment. So we need to be pretty careful in doing that. And I think we can learn a lot of things by operating on the moon for a longer period of time than we did during the Apollo missions. And we can learn how to set up places where on Mars that we could live for a little while, because you don't want to go there for 2 or 3 days and then come back. It's just cost prohibitive to do it that way. So I think going back to the moon in a thoughtful, logical, timely process makes a lot of sense, and we will learn the things that we need to know between those trips and from the non-human probes that we send out on a regular basis, and that we will be able to, over time, figure out how to go to Mars in a reasonably safe fashion. Not totally safe, obviously, but the probability of failures will be low enough that we'll be willing to commit human lives to do that. But Mars is going to be there when we get to it. The moon is going to be there when we get to it. I don't want to see us rush. I don't want to see us do things that are not consistent with safe engineering and safety practices. And I don't want to see us put people at more risk than is necessary to pull off a wonderful, great human endeavor like exploring Mars. So a timely approach, I think, is the best approach.
Do you think we could get there in 2024 to the moon, you said? To the moon.
Do I think we can? No, because I don't think we'll spend the money that it would take to do it that fast. You know, funding is everything. During the Apollo program, I think NASA got something like 6% of the federal budget. Now NASA gets less than 0.5% of the federal budget. So if you doubled NASA's budget, you know, that would be 1%. But I don't think Congress is going to allocate enough funds for us to pull off a trip in 2024 with the first female to walk on the moon. I could be wrong, you know. I'd like to think I am wrong, but I don't believe that's going to happen.
What about safety-wise? Do you think they'd be ready?
Well, that depends. There's we haven't flown the craft. We haven't flown the rocket we would use. We haven't flown the spacecraft that we would use. We haven't designed a landing craft that would be needed to do that. And so there's a lot of development work and test work that needs to get done before we set off on a plan like that. And I think if we hurry, speed is always the enemy of thoroughness, and I wouldn't want to see us going in that direction too far.
Okay, so the next question I have is from Ella, age 9. Do astronauts ever get bored? What do they do for fun?
Well, you know, she really should ask somebody who's spent 6 months on the space station. You might get a different answer, but I never got bored. I mean, if you weren't busy doing something on the flight plan that you were supposed to do, you were looking out the window and taking pictures of the Earth and marveling at the planet upon which we humans live. You just can't get enough of that. I mean, let's see. So when you're in orbit around the Earth, you know, the spacecraft is going like that in and it's at an angle generally. And the angle is called, the angle relative to the equator is called inclination, whatever this angle is of the orbit plane and the equator. If you launch from Florida and you launch due east, you're going to be in a 28.5-degree orbit. It's just going to turn out that way because of where you start. And so if you are in an orbit that's inclined to the equator like that, and this orbit is fixed in inertial space, the orbit doesn't change its angle relative to the stars. But the Earth sits down there underneath you, and the Earth rotates, right? The Earth goes around once every 24 hours. So every time you come up across the equator in your orbit, the Earth, the next time the Earth has rotated 22 degrees. And so over a period of orbits, you can see a lot of the Earth, depending upon how far north it goes and how far south your orbit goes. But you can see a great deal of the Earth. And the first time I flew, I was in a 57-degree orbit. And so we got to see almost all of the habitable portions of the Earth. We couldn't quite see up to the North Pole or the South Pole, but we could see most of the habitable portions of the Earth. And you don't get tired of looking at that. So I personally never got bored.
Okay, so I have several now about food. So I'm gonna read all three of them, and then I'll let you answer them. The first one is Jillian, age 6, is asking, how do you eat in space? And then Cody, age 9, is asking, why can't you bring regular food? Is everything hard to eat? And then Molly, age 11, is asking, is the food good, or do you just eat it because it doesn't float?
Actually, it does float. So it is regular food, and you eat it in a way that minimizes or eliminates stuff getting loose, crumbs, things like that. So stuff that's sticky, like scrambled eggs, you can eat that with a fork out of a little container that you'd open on orbit. But stuff that is more fluid, you have to keep it in the container and take it through a straw or something like that. Before you fly, you go over to the NASA kitchen at Johnson Space Center and you pick out all your food for the whole flight, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And they pack up what you say I want for that thing, and they store it in specific places so you can find it. And then we have a pantry that's got extra things like bite-sized crackers or things like that, peanut butter, stuff that you can keep under control, what you can eat if you decide you don't want to eat what you ordered before you took off. And everybody's taste buds change when they get on orbit. And I think that's due to the fluid shift that occurs in your body when gravity is not pulling the fluid down into your legs. It shifts up into your chest. And because the sensors in your body say, oh, you got too much fluid, you get rid of fluid through urination, sweat, just evaporation. And so your body changes a little bit, and that has affected a lot of people's taste buds. So things that you tasted really good on the ground now don't taste so good, and some that you just kind of were okay on the ground now, whoa, this is really good. And so it just goes like that. But it's regular food. It is the meats and things like that are radiated to kill any bugs or anything that would give you a stomach upset and that sort of thing. But it's just packaged in a way that is convenient to eat in a enclosed environment in 0G. So eating is just like eating on the Earth. You just have to prepare your food a little bit differently, and it is packaged a little differently, and you have to be careful you don't let it loose. I hope I covered all three of those.
Yes, you did. You did. So Randy, age 9, asks, are there any aliens in space?
Boy, if I knew that, I could retire. Oh, wait, I am retired. I didn't see any. I didn't see any. Now, let me say this. the universe is a really big place. And as Carl Sagan said, there are billions and billions of planets. A reasonable percentage of those could house life forms. The chances that there are life forms other than what we know about here on Earth elsewhere in the universe is 100%. But those life forms are on planets so far away that the travel time, unless we don't understand the laws of physics, the travel time is so long that the probability of ever running into a different life form from another planet is really, really small. I think they're there. I just don't think we're going to shake hands with them.
Okay, and so the last question I have is, what was the coolest part of your space mission?
Coolest part?
Yes.
You know, that's really tough. The whole thing from getting to work with the people who are so dedicated to our space program, getting to work with your crewmates, getting to work with the engineers who design and build and operate this stuff, and everybody is so dedicated to it to make sure that it happens as safely as possible and we accomplish great things. I mean, that's just a thrill. If you never got off the ground, that would be a thrill in and of itself. But the flights, those of us who are so fortunate as to get to go, it's indescribable what that experience is really like. It's the most wonderful thing that I ever experienced and that I can imagine. And I am a father, you know, I'm a parent. I've experienced all the human joys that we have in our lives, but flying in space was incredible. I think you all would love it.
Yeah, well, you tell him that I learned to graduate with him.
Oh,
From
that.
high school, yes.
What's her name?
I learned toner.
Hi, Verna. How are you? Nice to see you. Are you going to the reunion this fall?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, me either. I'm gonna miss this one too. So I'll see you at the next one that we both go to.
Okay.
All right, it's a deal. Now, for the young kids, and those of you who are young at heart, but really for people who still have their life ahead of them. Over the years, leading businesses in this space program and stuff, I have developed a concept with my teammates that I think is a good way to think about how you get to do what you want to do in life. And that, you know, we all know what the North Star is. You know, everybody in Michigan, you can see the North Star every night when it's not cloudy. And for centuries, people navigated by using the North Star and other stars as navigation points. And so it was a guidance, a way to navigate your way through the hazards of life when you were doing travel and that sort of thing. But we decided we can think about using the concept of a North Star as a way to navigate through our lives. And what I mean by that is if you have a plan, if you develop a plan and you stick to it and you ask yourself the question every time you have to make a significant decision, you know, is this consistent with my North Star? Is this consistent with what I want to do with my life while I'm alive? And if it is, then the answer should be, I'm going to do this. If it's not, you need to think real hard about if it's the right thing for you to do or not. And so we wrote down 4 little things, and I'm just going to show them to you. I didn't want this to be a lecture, but I would like you to look at that. Can you read it?
Yeah.
Okay. So what it says, follow your heart. That means do what you want to do. If you have a passion, chase it. Keep after it. If you want to devote your livelihood to something in particular, don't be dissuaded from doing it. Find the opportunities. There are opportunities abound, but nobody's going to come and tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, here's an opportunity. You have to seek them out. Seek out the opportunities that are consistent with your North Star, with the path you want to take in your life. Everybody has competitors in life, as we all know. And so you've got to be competitive. You know, you can't not make the grade when an opportunity comes by that you want to take advantage of. So you have to be competitive. And then as you go through your life, we think that sharing the journey with others makes it all that much more rewarding and worthwhile. So I tried when I was in college, as I said, and I decided I would like to be in the space program. I tried to follow a model like that. When we're in business and we want to make a business decision that we want to make it consistent with what our business goals are, we follow a process like that. I think that's a good model. And when I have the opportunity, I share that model with young people because you never know. They might remember it someday and it might help them. And they are our future.
Was there any other questions?
I have a question. First of all, I wanted to say thank you for being here, and we feel the same about you as you do Judy Collins.
Well, thank you.
But I was wondering what advice you have for us in Cass City to help inspire the next generation of explorers. Maybe it's to do what that helps teach that North Star. What else?
Okay, so you were breaking up a lot, but I got the gist of how do we inspire the future generations, especially to be future explorers. Well, you know, by showing up and having this conversation, you've already done something. These types of conversations with the young people are valuable. And there's all kinds of people that the young people can have conversations with that would be positive influences on their lives. You know, not every kid is going to pick up on everything, but every kid's going to pick up on something. Sooner or later along the way, something somebody says or shows or tells them about will make an impression on them and will help them find their North Star and start on their life's journey. So setting up things like this with people from all kinds of different career fields, I think is an excellent way to do it. Other than that, educate the dickens out of them, encourage them to stay in school, encourage them to go to college, encourage them to be inquisitive, and they will find a passion sooner or later. Not everybody does, you know, some of us are happy and content and have fulfilling lives, working 8 to 5 and spending lots of time as a coach in the Little League field and doing other things. But many of us, as you know, want to have careers that are fulfilling, rewarding, and make us feel like we've contributed to humanity within our lifetimes. And those are the kind of people that I'm talking about.
Oh, okay.
I understand.
So what they wanted to tell you was we have a new coffee shop in town, and there is a sandwich named after you.
Not funny.
What's in it?
Prime rib.
Prime rib. Oh, well, thank you.
Rib.
I hope that coffee shop survives.
Okay.
When you're flying in the ship, when the stars are up,
Can't hear.
do you hit?
Okay, come over here, buddy. We'll have you come up by the computer and ask him.
When you fly in the ship, do you hit stars or do you go through them?
Say that again.
When you fly in the ship, do you hit the stars or do you go through them?
No, you don't either. In the space shuttle, we flew in low Earth orbit. Low Earth orbit in the space shuttle was maybe from 120 to 360 miles above the surface of the Earth. So we're not getting measurably closer to any stars than you folks are when you're standing out in your backyard looking up at the stars. We're only at the most 360 miles closer, and that's immeasurable considering the distance to the stars. But we do fly through some neat stuff. For example, if you are in an orbit that has a northern and southern inclination that's high enough, you will fly through the northern and southern lights. And when you do fly through those, and you fly through them because they occur at the altitudes or the distance from the Earth that you're flying in, at that 100 miles to something above that. And when you fly through them, they are like alive. They're flashing, the colors and the light is moving around, and it's like you're flying through a living entity, a living light show. And that's really cool. Another thing you fly through is if you go through the South Atlantic anomaly. That's a place down over the South Atlantic that's like a hole that is similar to the poles where the magnetosphere of the Earth dips in, and it allows high energetic particles like from the sun and other cosmic sources to enter down into the atmosphere, and certainly at the altitudes that you fly in the space shuttle. And so when you go through that area, if one of those things goes through your brain, what you do, you see a flash of light. And the more flashes of light you're seeing during the time that you're there, which is just a few minutes, the more of these heavy particles that have gone through your brain. Now, nobody's done any studies yet to see, what that does to you, but it's a pretty cool light show.
If you have satellite TV, you can find on your TV the NASA station, and it is very interesting to watch. I've watched a lot of different programs, and they give you a lot of information about the space station.
Yeah, right. I know that. It's a great channel, and because of the Apollo 11 50th anniversary on public broadcasting system channels this week, there are lots of shows about the trips to the moon. They're also very interesting. There's a lot of cool stuff out there to be able to watch. Okay, well, thank you so much for spending some time. I've enjoyed it very, very much, and I hope that we'll get a chance to have another chat in the future.
All right. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Goodbye.